Welcome to this little hobby channel of mine, Motorcycle Ride, and our first talkie video on the channel itself. And this is going to be a long-term review of the Harley-Davidson Sportster, as I put about 16,000 miles along this. Along the way, I'm going to tell you how I got it, the modifications I've done to it and why, the problems I've had on it, my personal opinion about the bike, and I will tell you about some mods I have planned in the future so that I can more readily make content for this channel and the series of the build series I will do about those mods. But this being the first talkie, I thought I'd spend a little bit of time telling you about my goals for the channel and also give you a little bit of my background in motorcycling so that you can kind of gauge the value of my opinions when I talk about stuff. But before that, how about we discuss the bike? So this is a 2005 XL 1200R, or Harley referred to as the Roadster. And in my opinion, this is the best Sportster ever made. But they've been making these things since the 50s, and I'm sure every single person who's ever owned a Sportster thinks that their model is the best ever made. So let me kind of give you some reasons why I think this is the best one. History has shown that generally the most collectible of any kind of machine are the first of a generation and the last of a generation. And what's cool about this particular bike is it is a bit of both. It is part of the Evolution series of Sportsters, which are considered to be one of the most unkillable engines ever produced. Perfect for a half-wit mechanic who needs to keep whatever bike they buy on the road for a very long time at a very minimal amount of cost with just a basic set of hand tools and the ability to follow instructions in an owner's manual. This is that engine. Now, in 2004, to the entire Sportster lineup, they brought a new frame which introduced rubber-mounted engines, and that was a monstrous improvement. In fact, they used the same design, the same part numbers, the same jigs and all that kind of stuff to make the frames all the way up until the Sportster ended its production just last year. Over 20 years, or almost 20 years. So basically from 2004, you had the equivalent of a modern feeling Sportster. Now in 2007, because of emissions, this was the last motorcycle to convert fully over to fuel injection. And with that, it brought about, engine management computers, a whole new wiring harness setup, O2 sensors, different exhausts, that kind of stuff. A lot more complexity. So after 2007, you couldn't really do all the maintenance yourself. You needed the proper laptop with the proper connections and proprietary software to even diagnose what all the problems were. So between 2004 and 2006 is kind of the golden era where you still had a machine that was simple enough for an idiot like me to keep running forever at my workshop. In fact, really the only thing you couldn't do is machining stuff. And very few of us are taking the engine totally apart to replace pistons and liners and stuff like that very often. And even if you do the work, you take the cylinders out to the machine shop, you have it done, you brought it back. But you are able to do that one because of basic tools and basic ability to follow information. You don't need specialized stuff. So in my opinion, that 2004 to 2006 is the golden era of Sportsters. After that point, Harley started kind of turning their back to the home mechanics, in my opinion. In fact, a lot of the modern day Sportsters, you just don't even want to touch yourself. It's all service center kind of work. So this is something that I can keep on the road for the longest amount of time possible for the least amount of money without much effort. And that's a key point. Now, in that time frame, the Roadster was the top of the line model. Now, I know y'all are now looking at this thing right here and seeing how dirty this bike is and drawing an opinion of me as a motorcyclist because of me riding a bike this dirty. But I did this on purpose because there are some things about the wear and tear that will help me explain the performance aspect of this bike in the following section. So there's a reason why it's dirty. I don't normally keep it dirty like this one, but I did that on purpose. Now the Roadster, being the top of the line model, it is, if you follow the stages of performance improvements of the Harley engines, this is pretty much a stage 3 minus the loud exhaust. Because from the factory, you have a freer flowing air intake. You have a 1200cc motor bored up from 883, and you also have a hotter cam in that motor from Screaming Eagle. You have different timing on it, and they put on a unique head, a head that is very coveted by a lot of builders nowadays. This was designed and modified by Eric Buell from the Buell Motorcycle Company. It flows a lot better, a lot more air, and it bumps compression up a little bit. So you have all the elements of that stage 3 performance modification, but it's just not as loud as if you had aftermarket pipes on it. That resulted in an engine that you can read a bunch of different magazine articles and tests back in the day, and they're all plus or minus about 70 horsepower and 70 foot-pounds of torque, which makes this the most powerful Sportster engine ever released to the mass market. But in all seriousness, that is really nothing more than bragging rights, a little feather in your cap. There is so much more potential in these engines if you want to go down that route. Personally, me, I'd rather just keep it reliable. In my past, I loved high horsepower 4-cylinder engines, and I'll talk about that later on. But the character of this thing, you're just not competing in that level, so why not just keep it reliable and fun and have a very broad appeal? And that's what I liked about this engine now. I didn't when I first got it, but that's a story for a little bit later on. Other things that brought about with the Roadster moniker was full-size suspension. You have the full 13-inch shocks, which gave you all the travel that this thing was designed for. I do know a lot of people, including Harley-Davidson themselves, will lower the seat height and give it that slammed look by just putting on shorter shocks. To me, that's idiotic. Because not only by lowering the back end stuff, it changes the rake, which then you have to raise up the front forks in a little bit. It just affects everything, reduces ground clearance, and makes the bike ride a lot rougher. Just leave it at its stock height and you will enjoy the machine a lot more, in my opinion. They also gave you a peanut-style larger gas tank. This is 3.3 gallons. I average plus or minus 50 miles per gallon. And I typically, when I fill up, I'm only putting 2.6, 2.7 gallons in. So you have a huge reserve on the tank, and you're still going to get, 120, sometimes 130 miles before you go on reserve. So for a Sportster, that's good. For most motorcycles, that's below average. But the piece that really drove me to seeking out a Roadster when I started looking for a bike is it comes with dual disc brakes. And these aren't just any dual disc. They came from the big bore Harleys, so they were designed for a much heavier machine. So the performance is beyond what this rest of the bike is somewhat capable. And my history with riding, I've always been a little bit more aggressive on brakes, even though I'm not really a heavy horsepower person anymore. That's just been my riding style forever. So I prioritized getting dual disc brakes, And mag wheels, another thing that the Roadster, mag wheels advantage is that if you get a flat on the side of the road, it's a lot easier to repair that flat with a simple plug kit. Whereas if you have spokes, you have a tube, you're going to have to take the thing apart to repair the hole. It's just a lot more complicated. Spokes look cool, but they're just a lot more maintenance. And if you are taking this thing farther than, you know, a few hours from your home, it's a lot easier just having mags that you can repair any flats on the fly. And adding a second disc to a standard Harley Sportster is price prohibitive. It's just worth it just to seek out one that comes with it from the factory. Now that's the bike, so let's bring the conversation back to me because, you know, I'm after all the narcissistic YouTuber talking to a camera. No, seriously. I do earn my living on YouTube, though this, I said right from the get-go, is my hobby channel. My main channel is a woodworking channel where I take hand tool furniture making and wood turning called Worth the Effort Woodworking. The channel is titled Worth the Effort. Anyways, my history, my experience with motorcycles probably starts out like a lot of y'all's. Me riding a little XR80 around my grandfather's RV when we all went out camping. He taught me to ride first on a little 80 Elite. So I learned the throttle and brakes, and then I stepped up to the clutch with that XR80, and I remember doing that for summers on end. As a teenager, I absolutely devoured content through magazines and books about all different types. But the group I kind of hung around with, we were mainly motocrossers. Lots of practicing, a few racings. I was never very good, but that was kind of riding I did. And my personal fascination was high horsepower inline four-cylinder sport bikes. Throughout my late teens to the 20s and early 30s, I did what I kind of jokingly call the 14-year college plan to get my BA. In that I mainly went to night school and I worked during the day. Those jobs were at motorcycle dealerships pretty much. I can honestly say I have worked every single position in a dealership with the exception of a certified trained mechanic and an owner. And I actually did try to open up dealerships twice on my own. Once I did a lot of demographics and research, and I found the perfect location where the market was kind of there was a market there that nobody else was there, and I talked to the dealership, the manufacturers, the dealer network, and they told me a number that I needed to reach for financing, and I did that with my savings and some backers. Unfortunately, somebody else came in with more money, and a dealership went into the exact same shopping center I laid out. A few years later, I found another opportunity, more rural, and we were going to focus on side-by-side utility vehicles and ATVs, and this was back in the late 90s, before the big craze of side-by-sides right now, but generators and stuff like that, to launch a dealership on a shoestring budget because I was trying to do it by myself. That time I just got flat turned down, but within a year, that exact operation opened up there with somebody that had more money. So at that point in time, I had graduated college and I was just kind of pissed off with the entire industry. And I had, after being away from the industry for about a year or so, I kind of fell in love with teaching. And throughout all that time frame, I've been buying and selling motorcycles all the time. And when I left the industry, I bought my first brand new motorcycle, one that I'd ridden and fallen in love with. It wasn't the perfect bike, it wasn't the highest horsepower bike, it wasn't the best handling bike, but it was a great all-arounder and one that I really did think I would hold on to forever. And I would still like to find one to put in the collection just to look at a lot of times, and that was a Kawasaki ZRX 1200R. If that tells you the kind of riding I like to do at that time, if you know that bike. But the funny thing is, to take the teaching position, I had to move across state of Texas. So I sold all my machines, including that beloved ZRX, to pay for that move, thinking I just buy something else in a few months. I mean, that's been my pattern my entire life, adult life. Well, guess what? 20 years went by. Now, right at the beginning of COVID, I had a few videos on my woodworking channel that really took off. So I had a little bit of extra cash, and I thought I would like to get just a runabout. And in actuality, I started looking for a Trail 90 or 110, an old Honda from the 70s and 80s, because in my 40s, I kind of came to a realization that a lot of the products I would be buying at that point in time and in the future would be the last products I buy in that category. So I decided I really needed to buy quality stuff that I could use for the rest of my life. I have experiences with those old Hondas. I knew I could keep them running forever, and even though the big parts had stopped being manufactured, there was so much aftermarket stuff out there, and it was also cheap. I knew that parts availability would never be a big issue for that particular machine. So I started going to Facebook, Craigslist, and stuff like that. And the prices for those at the beginning of COVID, you couldn't buy a used one for the price of a new one. It was just ridiculous. But next to all those Trail 110s, I was finding Sportster ads everywhere. And these were low mileage Sportsters. It seems like a lot of baby boomers in the 90s and aughts, they would buy these things as either their first bike or their spouse or something for their kids to ride. They'd put 1,000 miles on them and then park them in the garage, and they wouldn't get rid of them for years. And then maybe they went out and they tried to start it up and the carburetor's gummed up, right? Because they're carbs. That's the bad thing about carbs. And so they would just stick them back in the corner, and then another 10, 15 years later, they would just be getting out of motorcycling so that they would put all of them up for sale, and they'd have to put up a motorcycle that looked pristine, had 1,000 to 3,000 miles on it, but they had to advertise that it doesn't run right. So there are deals out there. You can find good Evo Harleys dating back from the 80s all the way up to probably the mid-teens that are selling, $1,500 to maybe $4,000 for the very top line. This particular one I bought was, the guy was asking $4,000, but because of some things I'm talking about in the future, I was able to negotiate him down a little bit. And when I bought it, it didn't have 2,000 miles on it. The original owner had put less than 1,000 miles on it and traded it into a Harley dealership after about 4 years. That guy I bought it from him, and he put about 1,000 miles on it. So that kind of gives you the history of the bike and me recognizing that Sportsters were an option for me, because I did know that they were incredibly simple machines and that the production run didn't stop until just last year, so they were still making this engine and all the parts. So I knew parts availability would never be a problem for it. I also knew through experience that these things were incredibly simple. They were designed for people like me to work on. They wanted people like me to work on them originally. Nowadays, not so much. And it being a full-size bike, maybe I could do a little bit more than run around this college town, which I really thought, because I am on the edge of Texas Hill Country. So I started looking at Harleys, and I recognized that that was an option. So then I did my research, and I found the particular model I wanted. And this was something that was made after I left the industry. So this was all new to me. But I found the bike, found the buyer, and went ahead and got it. But that kind of gives you the reason why. I was wanting something to bop around my college town, maybe explore hill country, a couple times a season. I didn't think I was going to take it really seriously. I really just wanted something for around town so I didn't have to drive this gas-guzzling truck. But the important thing was I wanted me to be able to keep it running for the rest of my life and be able to pass it on. And that isn't something that I think I could do with a lot of the contemporaries of this machine, simply because they didn't have as long a production run. And most manufacturers, after about 10 years of a specific model, and what I mean by that is, they've been making CBR sport bikes forever, but the F1 version of it is different from the F2 version of it. So as soon as the F1 ended, 10 years out, this is general rules, the manufacturers would make enough parts for that bike in one large production run to hopefully last another 10 years. So by about 20 years, parts availability kind of becomes an issue. So all the bikes that I was looking in my price range in this kind of category, well, they were in the beginning of that cycle where they were be harder to find parts, harder to work on. Anything newer than this, I knew I would need a lot more specialized tools than I had, so that threw it out the window too. So it just kind of, the Sportster just really filled a very unique niche that a lot of other machines can't. But I need to clarify this. My entire motorcycling career, my opinion of Harley-Davidson is they didn't make the best motorcycles, but they did make great machines. And it was the attitude of building for a home mechanic, which is what made them good machines. And with the build of the Evolution, they tried to make it a long-lasting engine, not a high-performance engine, but something that was durable, oil-tight, and would last for a very long time. And that is something that I appreciated. So that brings me to buying this bike. As I said earlier, I bought it from was a second owner, making me the third owner. It was advertised at around $4,000, if I remember correctly. I do remember he advertised it as new tires, new battery, running, cosmetically perfect. All of those were lies, okay? Yes, the tires probably had 400 or 500 miles on them, or 1,000, because they were replaced when he bought the bike, a decade earlier. Same with the battery. When he bought it, the dealership put a new battery in it. Both of those have aged out. The battery wasn't holding a charge, and while the tires looked brand new, they were rock hard and slick and very scary to ride on. The bike also came with, I guess you called it a gunfighter seat. It's a very small, thin solo seat, and he had a second saddle, which was a comfortable touring seat, broad on for the driver, and a really fat seat for the back, and he had a little tiny luggage rack there. It also came with a fairly large touring windscreen. Okay, now all of those are now gone off the bike for the simple reason that the foam in those original seats, I don't know this for sure, but I was bottoming out the foam within, leaving my neighborhood. I just think it was just old foam. The seats were not comfortable. They were putting my butt to sleep within, by the time I got into town. And this windshield, it stayed on for one ride. I got up to highway speeds with that touring windshield, and it was literally beating my helmet. It gave me a headache. It was all the turbulence that was coming around it. I see a lot of people riding with that style of windscreen, and I do not know how they do it. It did run, but it didn't run very well. It wouldn't take full throttle, and the idle was way off, almost as if one of the cylinders was firing every other time, and it got hot pretty quick. So I could use all those, and there are a few cosmetic things on it because while it was sitting in his garage, things had fallen on it. All of those things were stuff I didn't really care about. They were just details that allowed me to keep getting him to lower the price down because it just wasn't what it advertised. And I think I got a very fair price for this kind of machine in the shape it was. First thing I did when I got it back here is I pulled the wheels and tires off, and I sent them off to have the tires replaced, and I got very inexpensive. I think they're Shinko brands. They're new to me. I'd never heard of them before, but I've got 16,000 miles on them now, and I got a lot more to go. It's really shocking to me, somebody that used to have to replace tires every 3,000 to 7,000 miles on my old bike. So they're just really durable, if not hard. And then while those are being at the dealership, if it took me an hour to clean the carbs, I would be surprised. And that's something I want to point out to those of y'all that have never worked on a machine. This is the perfect one to get your teeth wet with. There's little you can really mess up on them. The tuning aspect, just go online, tell the experts what you have, the bike, what kind of bike you have in, what mods they do. They will tell you what jets to put into it, and you're gonna be 95% there, right there. All I did was I took the carburetor out, I pulled the jets out, I put them in a parts cleaner, and I cleaned everything up, and I reassembled it. The bike did come with Vance and Hines pipes, but I know that they didn't rejet the carburetors for those pipes because the plug for the air-fuel mixture was still on there. And that's the first thing you have to take off to tune a carburetor for that bike, for those pipes, which is probably one reason why it wasn't running that great. So after that, I now had a motorcycle with new, safe tires on it. It was running well, at least for on both cylinders, idled perfectly, wasn't popping, sputtering, or anything like that. So I assumed it was running as it should be. And I need to say this: I hated it. I absolutely hated it. There was a time when I was working dealerships, I used to, it was a common saying for me, I can have fun on anything with two wheels and a motor. There's only one motorcycle in my entire life that scared me so bad, not because of the performance, but it was so weird in handling. That was a Kawasaki Mach 3. A Mach 4, the 3-cylinder, 2-stroke bike. I fully restored one. I rode it to the dealership. I parked it. I put it in the back of my truck, and I never started it up again. I sold it to a gentleman who I hope put in a collection to just look at and not ride. That machine was utterly terrifying, and I hated it. And that's the only machine I can say that until I rode this one. The things I hated on was the vibration of the bike. This was different from every other motorcycle I've ever ridden, even though I took a 20-year hiatus between riding it. But I remember, motocross, both like the more contact you have with the machine, the more in control you have it. So you are sliding your legs on it. You're squeezing. You're weighting the foot pegs. You're putting weight on the handlebars. You're pulling back. You're doing all this stuff to keep your center of gravity still while controlling the machine around you. Same with sport bikes. You're leaning, you're weighting, you're bracing, all that kind of stuff. But on this machine, it seems like your objective is to touch it as little as possible. I mean, my hand, in the state of tuning it was in at that time, went numb before I got out of my neighborhood. And by the time I got to town, this hand was, couldn't control it, it seemed like. I didn't really have any problems with the foot pegs vibrating and all the other stuff because I took that attitude that I wasn't going to be squeezing the bike. Maybe that's why Harley riders spread their legs out like that, because like that on the highway pegs, is so that they don't have to touch a machine. But there are other things about riding it. The stock suspension on this thing was utterly confused. Guys, I know, I'm fat. And after that first week of riding it, I seriously questioned whether I was just too heavy for this machine. Because the rear shocks, I was bottoming them out all over the place. And that shock wave went straight up my spine because these mid-sized feet, notice that they are in front of my knees, not my hips or center of gravity. I cannot just lift myself out of the seat. I actually have to pull forward to get my center of gravity above my heels in order to lift out, which is an extra step, which most of my riding career, I've been using my legs as somewhat suspension to make it easier for the machine to work over bumps, and so I wasn't as tired. In this bike, you are sitting in the saddle and your spine is going to take every single impact. There just isn't any way to use your legs as suspension. I imagine it's even worse for those of y'all that pick forward mounted controls because you're forced in this leg forward position. So that rear shock just bottoming all the time, even though I had maxed out the spring preload, was a problem. But the even worse problem was the front forks. Now, the fork design that they use, it's contemporary. It's like the, what do they call that? It's not a dampener rod or anything like that. It's basically a rod, and then you have that washer with holes in it that's sitting in oil. So as you compress the forks down, the oil has to go through the passages, and you can only get so much oil through a passage at any given rate. So on high impact kind of stuff, it resists the motion, but on slow rollers and stuff like that, it flows smoothly. I think that's probably the suspension they still have on the touring setup, that kind of stuff. But this one, for some reason, I think it's the term's foaming. I'm not 100% sure about that one. But if you have oil and you get air pumped into it, so there's lots of bubbles in there, the viscosity isn't there. So high impact bumps just kind of create it foamy, so it just flows a lot more. So I would go down these asphalt roads, which aren't that new here, and the wheel would be vibrating up a little bit, and then all of a sudden I come up to the first stop sign and not pushing it on, grab the front brakes, and the thing would bottom down front. And that rate between whether the oil was thin or thick seemed to change. So I had no confidence in this machine at all. Plus the fact the brakes started working funky on me too. All of that can be accredited to rubber parts that had aged badly over time because they hadn't been used, I would assume. But I hated it so much that I literally put it up for sale a few weeks after I bought it. I got it running right. I had tires on it. I rode it around for maybe 500, 1,000 miles, and I was upset, had buyer's remorse. This just wasn't what I wanted. So I put it up for sale. And also the pipes that were on it, they were so loud, I was kind of embarrassed, and I am someone that has never liked loud bikes. I don't think it saves lives. I think the research has proven that one right there. It just draws attention and makes you an annoyance. And my neighbor who lives, 50 feet that way, their daughter just had a daughter who was literally a few weeks old. So I just needed to, it was too loud as it was. But as I talked about earlier, I kind of committed to myself that I wouldn't buy disposable stuff. And I knew that every expert out there said that what was great about the Sportster was its simplicity and its ability to modify it to do anything. People were turning them into off-roading adventure cycles. I personally remember people road racing them. In fact, they had an entire road racing series where you would put rear sets, reverse a shift pattern on it. The class was 883, so everybody was putting 1200cc cylinders on the back one because they only checked on the front one to gain horsepower advantages. It was a kind of a cheater series, but it was fun to watch. People were doing everything with Sportsters, so why was I having such a problem with it? So I bit the bullet and I just decided I would throw another $1,000 at the machine to modify it to fix the problems I had. So the first thing I did was I found a set of stock exhaust pipes. These actually came off of a custom, that's why there's the slash cuts out there, but you get, as long as you find one anywhere between 2004 and new, they will fit. If you get pipes from a one that's fuel injected, you just might have to close the little bung hole that they had for the O2 sensors. not that big a deal. I just happened to find one between 2004 and 2006. And I want to say I spent maybe $100, $120, and they were pristine, not a scratch on them, because the original owner had taken it off his or her bike almost instantly to put on something louder. I then turned around and sold those Vance and Hines, which just covered the cost for these stock ones because of the shipping and all that kind of stuff. It was kind of a swap right there. I will say this, I haven't touched the carburetor since I did that one, so this is running a little bit rich, meaning the spark plugs that change out when I do oil changes, they're smoky. They aren't the tan. So I will adjust that in a future video when I talk about the build series I'm doing for how I'm going to be modifying this for the next stage of me using it. Anyways, I did the exhaust system on it. I also spent a lot of time on the suspension and the handlebars. On the suspension, the first thing everyone's going to tell you to do is swap out the rear shocks. So I replaced them, just straight up replaced them with the absolute cheapest set of performance shocks from Progressive. Here are the ones that came off the machine. They have probably 2,000 miles on them. I probably ought to sell them. But this is an upgrade that any of y'all can do, even with no mechanical ability, because it was literally taking 2 bolts out for each side and putting the new shock on. Now, the shocks that came off of it were 13s. I don't know, in the back of my mind, I think I put 13.5s on this one because of my weight. But either way, I'm really happy with them. I have not bottomed these back shocks out since I bought them, and I do not have the spring preload in their max setting. It is firm, but I'm really happy with that. But I'm even more happy with what I did on the front forks, because that totally changed the personality of the bike. I did not know this was even possible, but nowadays you can take the old style suspension components, those dampener, emulsor, I think an emulsor rod is what they call them, and just basically swap out all the internals for a cartridge design. And it's not much money. And while the rear shocks might take you 30 minutes to improve, this took me about an afternoon, because you had to take the front wheel off, the fenders, the brake calipers, all that stuff. You pull the forks out, and you basically, there's a screw down on bottom to drain all the oil. Then you take the screw off top, and then a locking screw on bottom, and you dump out the interiors of the old parts. I mean, that's it. That's what was inside these forks. No big deal. Then you slide in this new cartridge internal, put the bolt on bottom, put in just a little bit of oil, not even nearly what the used oil, the old oil contained, and that's just so that to keep the exterior of that cartridge lubricated, and then reassemble the top. That was such a major improvement. I mean, I'm a heavy guy, and in heavy braking, this thing is not diving that much. In fact, when I reassembled it, I did an old motocross trick where I put a zip tie on the fork. So as this compresses, that tells you how much of your suspension travel you're using. I haven't touched it since, so that right there is probably the maximum travel I've ever used, because I have bottomed it out once or twice over some big whoop-de-doos in the Texas back hills. I have not ridden this bike in about a day, and there's been a lot of pollen in here, and me just bouncing around on it, this right there, that's pollen. So you can see how much it moved, just me bouncing around with it not running. So that right there is my initial sag, probably half of that, and then me bouncing around. So you can see how much travel I do. But you can also see the wear marks. Most of my riding is about 80% of the total travel, which is pretty much ideal for a street bike. It probably could be a little bit more. I know that when I put this together, the kit comes with 3 spring preloads, and I put all 3 because I'm fat. But if I were to redo this and not go touring, where I'm going to be having a lot more luggage on the bike, a lot more weight, I would actually probably take one of those out so that it will use more of the travel on my daily ride. But right now, this is firm, this is supple, it is not soft, and the balance between the front and the back is about equal, meaning whenever I go over bumps, the bike kind of does this. It's not coming down the front end, springing back faster than the back, causing a pogo action, which gives me confidence in the machine. I can trust what it's going to do. It is consistent, which when I say it transformed the personality of the bike, I enjoy riding this now. I am nowhere near as aggressive a rider as I used to be. I don't know if that's just the age or me riding to the personality of the machine. But for what I'm doing, bopping around town and maybe every other week going and exploring Texas Hill Country, this suspension now works well. And it's something any of y'all can do to any Sportster you buy. If you're happy with it now, ride it for a while until you want to improve it and then invest that money to begin with. But front and back, I don't think I spent $500 in parts to do all of this. Maybe 600, but somewhere in that price range for this upgrade to make the bike something I will keep for a long time. Now, a weird thing is that, remember I told you that my hands were going numb before I even left my neighborhood, which is about 2 miles down asphalt roads. Well, something about making the suspension better affected the amount of vibration that was being transferred back to me, which tells me that the stock suspension was just transferring all that, every single road imperfection to me as a high frequency vibration, which was causing my hands to work, even though it felt mushy. So I would say about half the obtrusive vibrations that I was enduring was solved by the suspension upgrade. But still, my hands were going numb, specifically this one, anytime I got on the highway. It's strange. I'm about 60 miles from Austin, Texas. I get on the highway, and then within a quarter there, I'm kind of already finching. My hands are uncomfortable. But I can head out for 100 miles on the back roads of hill country, and I don't have much problem. I think it's just the sitting at a constant speed, which is what is causing my issue. And the issue is only with my throttle hand. Maybe it's because I just let go of this hand quite often going down the road. So here are the things that I did to alleviate the vibration in the handlebars, which is really the only vibration that I found objectionable. I've tried 3 different sets of bars. The stop bars that came with this one were a lot wider. I just didn't like them because they were outside my shoulder level. I like the stock handlebars that came on the bike, the most standard Sportster, but those vibrated quite a bit. I then got a slightly lower profile ones, which these are. Vibration didn't change any, so it's still objectionable. I then did an old school trick and tried a bar snake, which is just a rubber hose that you run through the entire bars. But I found that there's an obstruction in these handlebars right at this point. So I could only get the bar snake in about a quarter of the way, and it didn't make any difference whatsoever. I then went through some other tricks that we used to do, like running BBs for like pellet guns, BB guns in the handlebars, and then filling it with some kind of resin, like epoxy or stuff like that, so that the BBs could move a little bit. That didn't do much at all. The only thing that made any kind of difference is 2 things. I swapped out my grips to ones that were a little bit thicker and had these rubber inserts. I don't know if you can see that right there. They're the Kuryakin, I'm not sure how you say that one. And those gave me bar end weights. Those made a bit of a difference. The other thing is I added a vibration bar. this thing right here. And the only reason I have this one is because I only put it on this side. That side I was happy with. And as you can see, it has two rubber things on the side that are a little bit thicker than it right here. Then it has a screw that goes front to back. So as you squeeze it, the rubber will squeeze out a little bit. And that you put in the handlebar and you squeeze it. So this bar, heavy bar, I mean, that's got some serious weight to it, actually is suspended in the middle of the handlebars with only two contact points. So the rubber aspect takes away some of the vibration. And that did help quite a bit, but not fully. To this day, on long trips, my throttle hand still gets a little numb. Now, some of you old school riders are just going to be saying that I'm gripping the handlebars too hard or I have too much weight on it. One of those is true. I will tell you, my personal riding style, I've always kept a very loose grip on it. It comes from, I guess, my motocross background. So I'm not squeezing the handlebars very much. I will say on this particular bike, I do not rest my hand on the brake lever because that tends to make my fingers numb, and I don't let my fingers dangle, just resting my palm. I do wrap them around because dangling they go numb. But just a light squeeze, a light pressure on with my hands, and I've never had problems with forearm pump. Now, I will say, this is something new to me, this little paddle that they want on in. This was an accessory that came with the grips that I thought I would just try. And that has made a very big difference. Because as you're going down the highway, you just kind of use your palm to set your kind of cruise speed, and you're not gripping at all. Now, this handlebar does cant my back a little bit forward. See how that? Versus how a lot of people who ride with buckhorns, their backs are somewhat straight, which means that I am putting a little bit of my body weight forward. I'm not gripping the handlebars, but I do have some weight on them. I like that for the type of riding that I bought this bike for, around town riding. It feels more natural to me to have a little bit of weight on the handlebars, going over bumps, through the neighborhoods, dicing with traffic, that kind of stuff, than sitting back and just letting my hands rest and doing the pulling action to steer. This feels better for me. But me turning this somewhat into a touring machine, I do need to figure out, if I want to keep this, some way to have some kind of convertible action so that I can, on long touring trips, come back up here. Because if I don't have my body weight on my handlebars, I do believe a lot of the vibration problems I have will go away, or at least be alleviated a lot. Now, I will say there's also one other thing, and this comes stock with Harleys, is underneath the handlebar there is a little screw, so you can tighten up the action of the throttle. And this comes because Harleys are old school. They use two throttle cables instead of how most manufacturers just use one in a spring to return it. Harleys still have the spring, but they've kind of always used two things. So I can actually tighten this up a little bit so that I can turn the throttle on, and notice it stayed. Okay? It's a throttle lock of sorts. But because it's adjustable, you can kind of fiddle with the tension. And a lot of times, I've been doing it so much, you just use your thumb on this little star wheel. You move it forward so that if you're just going through Texas country roads, I will set it so it will give me about 20 seconds of steady throttle, and then just the normal road vibrations will slowly return it to its main position. Or if I want to, I'm going down the highway and no traffic around, I'll do it a little bit more so it doesn't feel like there's more tension, but I do have to physically roll off the throttle to close the throttle. That is because this is one of those do as I say, not as I do. I have been known to sit here with no hands on the handlebar for dozens of miles on some of these Texas highways, just using my foot pegs to steer around the right lane. And this thing is stable enough. I've never had any issues with it. But do that at your own peril, because if you start getting some kind of wiggling, it takes you a second to grab back on the handlebars to control it. And there are just 2 other mods I've done to this bike to make it more suitable for me using around town and my short hops. As I said earlier, I took off that touring windscreen because, well, I should say this. I ride with a full face helmet. It just makes my riding experience much more pleasant for me. I know a lot of cruiser riders wear those half helmets and stuff like that, and I never really understood why they would prefer that tall windscreen over clean air. Because with that windscreen in my helmet, it was sitting here and the wind was just kind of tapping you all the time. That's what buffeting feels like. Just somebody hitting your head like this all the time. You get a headache pretty quickly. Whereas without any kind of windscreen, I'm in still smooth air moving forward. And that full face helmet, you have a little bit of pressure, which means if you're riding all day long, your back might be a tad bit sore until you get acclimated to it. But once you get acclimated to it, it's no big deal. It's just you did get hit by bugs. So I rode this bike for probably 5,000 miles with no windscreen at all and no care in the world. I mean, it just was perfectly fine. Then I started going out into Texas Hill Country where I was sitting at 70, 75 miles all the time, and I was getting a little bit tired constantly leaning into the wind. So with my experience, my past experience and knowing what small windshields felt like, I found this one. It came from England. It's from Dart. You may like the looks, you may not like the looks on it, but I will tell you this, it works. It keeps the wind coming off this very smooth to about right here. And if you look in some of my videos, you might see my elbow, my sleeves, when I do ride in short sleeves sometimes in the heat, in the mirrors, and they are flapping like anything. But my t-shirt itself, which you can't see, is fairly still because this is still air and there's not a lot of turbulence coming off of it, so my helmet's not getting beat. The helmet is in smooth air. This is still air, and I get a little bit of pressure on my shoulders from the wind coming off of it. So it makes this thing really comfortable long distance for me compared to not having this small, what they call fly screen. Okay, so that's why that is there. And this manufacturer does make it in clear in case you don't like that solid black one. The other thing, I will say this, when you look at this one, in all the pictures, you only have one instrument and it fits a little bit better for the Sportsters that only have the speedometer right here. One of the things you get with the Roadster, I think I forgot to mention this one, is it does come from the factory with a nice tack. So I have 2 dials up here. That was a little bit tricky getting fitted perfectly. In fact, the windscreen is touching a tad bit on this one right here, and I have a little piece of felt on the inside so it doesn't vibrate. But the other thing I added to this was my tail pack. I know it's not the prettiest thing in the world, but this right here transformed this bike into just from a little fun toy to something I can use daily. What it is I went and bought the cheapest sissy bar I could find. Didn't even care what it looks like because I haven't seen it since I put it on. And then I bought a backpack. Now, I refuse to wear a backpack. I hate riding with backpacks on me. But this is a top loader backpack, which you can see I strapped it down the bike and I have never removed it. It's canvas, so it dries out fairly easily. But I can fit a couple 12 packs of soda in here, milk, water, groceries for a week for me. Basically, my rule of thumb is I'll get the shopping carts, and anything I can put in that kids section will fit in this bag easily. I also have a mesh shoulder strap in here just in case I overbuy, and I've only had to use that once. But other than that, you put everything in, and then you just close it up from the top. And when it's like that, so you can see it holds a lot of stuff. And whenever I don't use it, when I wrap it around, I just kind of fold this up underneath, and I can use this to kind of cinch it down so it's not as ugly. But that right there added the utility I needed to use this as a daily. So what's this like to ride? Well, I've already covered the suspension and how that changed the bike, so it feels stable and I have confidence in it. Speed-wise, I'm not sure if it's just me in my 50s and I've just matured and I'm just not riding as hard, or my riding style is affected by the character of the bike. Because I will tell you this, I'm not full throttling this all the time, which is why I said that 70 horsepower is kind of a bragging rights, but it's not that big a deal. Most of my riding is practically treating this like a diesel engine. I'm going from between 2,000 and 4,000 RPMs and just kind of going back and forth around town. And that gets me way ahead of traffic, and 3,000 RPMs is right about where the horsepower and torque peak are. So it gives me the most response to get out of emergency situations. I will tell you, these Evo Sportsters, they hit a point between 3 and 32 where everything on the engine just smooths out. It just turns really, really smooth. And if I can ride in that situation, I don't have any vibration problems with my hands at all. But it's the fact that sometimes you're going up to closer to 80 in Texas to go with traffic, or if I'm lugging it down around 2,500 RPMs, the vibrations increase. 3,000 RPMs is its happy medium. The red line on this thing, the dial says 6,000, but the ignition, I think it's like 6,500 right there. I've hit it a few times, but it's just not the character of the bike. You just kind of short shift this around and carry speed through corners. This thing is fun to lean if that's what you like to do. But I think you've seen my videos. When I'm recording, I do back off quite a bit, but I like smooth lines. I like rolling corners, whether low speeds or high speeds. I just like the flow, and that's how this bike rides. I don't ride this bike for the excitement factor, but I do ride it for the relaxation factor. And one of my favorite things to do is when I've been working all day long and I'm literally covered with sweat in the summer, is to do something I think I should tell you to never do. I will put foam earplugs in, no helmet, and I will idle around this suburban neighborhood in second gear, which puts me about 20, 25 miles an hour, and count deer, so to speak. And it just kind of dries me off, it cools me down, it relaxes me, and I've been known to spend 30, 45 minutes doing just that, just putzing around the neighborhood, looking at houses and cars and stuff like that. I've really enjoyed that late in summer. And that kind of tells you the kind of riding that this thing is perfect for in the setup I have for it now. So this is a bike I now could see owning for the rest of my life because I can keep it running. I'm finding it infinitely useful on a daily basis and as a relaxation tool when the workday is over. But remember, when it was stock, I utterly hated it. Now, maintenance-wise, over these past 16,000 miles, I really haven't had to do too much due to the motorcycle. I change the oil every 5,000 miles, and I think that's what the factory recommends. For me, it's just a math issue whenever it turns over something divisible by 5,000 miles. I change the oil and filter. The Sportsters do come with two oil areas. You have the oil tank, and then you have a separate oil setup for the clutch and gearing and stuff like that, which is kind of nice because it keeps a lot of debris from your clutch plates and stuff out of the engine itself. But you do end up putting almost as much oil in this as you would a car engine. I think it takes about 4.5 gallons. I don't believe I've ever burned oil on this bike, but I have found that towards the end of the oil change cycle, I'm adding about a half a quart in, and here's why. The hose is going to and from the oil bladder Well, you can see that there's a lot of grime on them. That's one of the reasons why I didn't want to wash this bike before I did the video. So there's something about the rubber that is, or the joinery, that's been leaking. And it's been like that ever since I bought it. I should have replaced it, but I've never had a single drop of oil underneath the engine. So it's just kind of a misting or sapping that can probably be traced back to rubber that has just aged from being sitting around for so long. And that's kind of the situation with every single rubber part on here. So part of the things I'm doing before I go on a long distance trip is I am going to be replacing all the rubber hoses, including on the brakes, front and rear, and the engine. And that should be a very simple job that I think would be a good example to show you that anybody can work on this machine. Cosmetically, one thing I don't like about the bike, but you can probably tell I'm not really hung up about cosmetics and machinery, is this crinkle paint they have. And notice it has been flaking off of the main case right here. I think that's because maybe there was a gas drip at one time and just kind of ate through to the bare aluminum. But I will say this painted kind of surface kind of spots a little bit. So no matter how you scrub it, it's always going to look older. It doesn't look like when it was brand new. And this crinkle paint is what they use on all the black engines and that kind of stuff. My personal opinion is I actually just kind of like the looks of either the chrome or the natural engines that have been polished. I think they're more Harley-esque, but it's all personal opinion. But this crinkle paint has come off around here because of, I assume, gas leaking over time before I got the bike. And that has been that way since I've had it. Also, cosmetically, I will tell you that every single piece of chrome accessories that I put on, like these handlebars and these mirrors and the sissy bar out there, rusted. And it's just cheap Chinese stuff, I assume. So every time I go to wash a machine, I'm taking some steel wool and I'm just kind of removing those rust marks like that right there. And as you can see, it shines right back up, but it's going to rust back up again. It's kind of frustrating, that aspect of it, but it's just cheap chrome processing for people that are selling parts on the cheap. Don't know what to do. I have replaced both mirrors on this bike when I got it, because this one on the side, evidently a ladder had fallen off of it and the mirror itself broke. They are cheap aftermarket ones. They are not Harley-Davidson ones. I will say I don't believe the Harley-Davidson ones have had this rust issue, because I've seen some in parking lots and they never seem to be like this. I don't keep this outside, but I do keep it in a carport, so it never really gets rained on, though I have ridden through rain, and you don't have that dew settling on it. So this is just atmospheric water rusting these items over time. The biggest mechanical issue that I've had is batteries. I'm now on my 4th battery in 16,000 miles. As I said earlier, the original owner said that he put a new battery in it, but when I got it, it wasn't holding a charge very long. So there was a battery replacement number 1. The second battery I had for about 1,000 miles, and somehow the negative terminal literally snapped in half. So I would be going down the road and would be cutting on and off because it was literally lifting off the battery every now and then. Took me forever to diagnose that problem. That's probably something that if you put into the shop, you would have probably gotten a couple hours of diagnostic, because when you just looked at it, the crack it fit perfectly. You physically had to move it to separate it out. So there was battery number 2 in the bike. The third battery I put in only lasted about 10,000 miles, 1 year. And this is now the 4th battery. You may notice I don't have the cover on it because I'm having a problem with this battery where the negative terminal keeps loosening up. When I'm riding the machine, I have no problems because the vibration of the machine is keeping the contact of that terminal. But sometimes, just sometimes, whenever I start the bike, I hit the starter and it just goes completely dead. It lights up, you hit the starter, it goes completely dead. So if I just come over here and hit it like that, the thing starts back up. So I've tightened that up multiple times. I just don't understand why it's loosening up. The other thing is I did get stranded once. It was after I rode in the rain. This right here is the main fuse of that. And I struggled to figure out why this thing was completely dead. I actually had to call friends in, go get my pickup truck. I brought it back in here. Luckily, I was within town. And as I was going through things, one time I just went to check the main fuse, pulled that out, and water poured out of the cap. And then I reassembled it, and everything seemed to run fine after it dried out. So if you have a problem like that, that might be an issue, that water just got inside the main fuse. Haven't had any other mechanical issues other than that. I'm not sure I can blame the Harley for any of that. Battery issues, that's battery issues. This right here could have been my issue, maybe with power washing it, but it did happen right after a major rainstorm that I got stuck in. So there's that. The belt of the bike has kind of been a really surprise to me. This is the first bike I've owned long term with a belt, and it rides just like a chain. There's no jacking like with a shaft or anything like that. I adjusted it right when I bought the bike a little bit, and I think I adjusted it right at about the 10,000 mile mark, not much. But as you can see, with a little over 16,000 miles now, I could probably fine tune that one, but that's pretty good. That's in the middle. It's not that much. So it's pretty much maintenance free. Nothing like a chain where I was lubing it every few gas tanks in riding. So this has been kind of a nicety. And on Sportsters, you never really have to worry about valve adjustments because they are hydraulic. I have been told that probably at about the 45, 50,000 mile mark, I might want to exchange some parts in here, but that's something anybody can do themselves. And to look out for any kind of leaking right here, which I have never had. So it's oil tight, which is nice. Now, one thing that has been kind of nagging me in the back of my mind, dealing with this high frequency vibration issue that I've had that's caused my hands to go numb, is one of the benefits of this modern frame design is the rubber mounting. But as you can see, rubber goes bad over time, especially just sitting. And I've done research, and in automobiles, rubber engine mounts, they have a lifespan of about 7 years, even though a lot of people never really think about them. I am sitting here wondering if the rubber in the motor mount has just aged, has hardened over time, and that would transfer some high frequency vibrations from the engine into the chassis and they end up in my hands. So as an experiment, these rubber motor mounts look good. There's nothing wrong with them cosmetically, but they are 20 years old. That rubber has to have hardened over that time frame. So in an experiment, I am going to, on this channel, swap out rubber motor mounts, and then I can give you an opinion on whether that improved it for the touring aspect. But that's my goal, is to get pretty much all the rubber parts on this machine swapped out before I venture out long distances. And speaking of future videos in that build series, which again, those are going to be the only talking videos I do, most of my content is going to be silent POV rides, is I'm going to prepare to make this thing not only more useful around town by getting rid of this and building me what they used to call a parcel tray, which was a common accessories on solo Sportsters back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but they don't seem to do at all anymore. So I'm going to have to weld up a parcel tray, and I want to have a removable luggage system, a backrest built specifically to hold my camping gear that I can take on and put on that parcel tray, so that just going around town, I can have nice storage sitting behind me, but whenever I go on long trips, I can have everything. That's going to be one of the big things in the build series. Now, my plans for this bike have changed because I've started doing this motorcycle ride video series. This channel is not going to be a lot of talky builds. I am going to do a short series on modifying this bike to make it a little bit more touring capable so that I can make videos for this channel. And those videos are going to be silent videos, so to speak. You're just going to hear the wind in the bike, and I'm just going to record some of the best roads I can find in Texas this first year, and hopefully in future years I can take a couple months off and explore it. And having this channel is kind of a little bit of motivation for me to not work as hard in the wood shop. I don't think I will ever make money on this channel, but in the back of my mind, I can see making a catalog of POV riding some of America's greatest roads, and a retired gentleman in an old folks home just putting it up on the TV and letting it run in the background, and just every now and then looking up and remembering what he used to do or she used to do. I could see a dealership putting this kind of video on their screen as just a background noise at a dealership to keep people to relax a little bit and stick around when they're in the offices doing paperwork and stuff like that. Just exploration of the prettiest stuff you will see on a bike. And I think if I can develop a good catalog, that might be something useful to the general audience, something that you don't see out there, because most of it is just, 10 minutes cut up of the best stuff. And you might have noticed that to accommodate those 10-minute videos, I have put a second camera on this bike on a few of the roads and come up with a hyperdrive series where I just speed up the video and you get to bank around these roads as if you're on an airplane. So those are the two kinds of videos that in the long run I think will make up the majority of the catalog of this channel, because that's what I'm enjoying making. I have another YouTube channel that earns me the money where I'm sitting here talking all the time. As you can see, I am able to talk quite long periods of time over some subjects. But yeah, that's where I'm going on this channel. And that's my experience in riding this thing for 16,000 miles. It is wonderful around town. It is enjoyable for those 100, 200-mile trips. In its current configuration, I would not want to take it moto camping for a week or a month at a time, but I hope in the future to modify it so it can do that well. And you will see those modifications in the future build series. And the fact that the majority of these videos will just be those silent videos is one of the reasons why I called this channel Motorcycle Ride, because that could mean an event I go to where I'm just kind of the POV person representing for y'all. That's a motorcycle ride. It could be the journey. That's a motorcycle ride. Or it could be me doing the occasional build video, such as this one right here, talking about my motorcycle ride. Hope you enjoyed this, picked up a few tips and tricks right along the way. But remember, just get out there, be safe, and have fun.